Hello, kia ora, and welcome to CookieCast, the podcast that's all about the Cook Islands. This is the place to meet people who have their own insight into this Polynesian paradise in the South Pacific. I'm John Roberts, and if, like me, you've ever visited the capital island of Rarotonga, you'll almost certainly have shopped at the biggest and most prominent store in the centre of town, the CITC, the Cook Islands Trading Corporation. It started out as the Cook Islands Trading Company, and it's the closest the islands get to a superstore. CITC has been part of the country's history for more than 100 years. And it's no exaggeration to say its story has helped shape today's nation, thanks to the strength, determination, and commitment of its founding father, Robert McKegg. He was known to all as Boss, but to my guest today, he was grandfather.
Boss chose a life far removed from family most of the time, where constant dramas and heartaches often left him feeling unwell. Yet he persevered, building a business that, taken over by his son Neil, became central to the Cook Islands' development. Through his story, we see the evolution of the Cook Islands themselves, from a missionary outpost when he arrived in 1910 to a New Zealand protectorate, through world wars and economic upheavals towards independence and modernisation.
My guest today, Adie Swinburn, reading an extract from a truly fascinating book she's written about Boss McKegg. Now, I'd normally start by saying kia ora, but as you're joining us from Auckland, New Zealand, Adie, I think I should be saying kia ora?
Kia ora is the Maori way, the New Zealand Maori way, yes.
Either way, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining me. Adie, this is a story that began in 1910 when your grandfather was just 23 at the time, and he ended up by chance on Rarotonga. How did that come about?
My grandfather left Auckland on a boat, on a steamer, headed for San Francisco, where he planned to seek his fortune. On the boat, he encountered a chap called Mr. Grove, who had a business in Rarotonga called W.H. Grove. And Mr. Grove was obviously persuaded by Boss that he had some good bookkeeping skills. And Mr. Grove asked Boss if he would rather than continue on to San Francisco immediately, break his journey and stop in Rarotonga for a little bit to show Mr. Grove or to talk to Mr. Grove about his books. The books of his business, which is what Boss did. But he actually did not get back on that steamer for another 10 years because he was captivated by Rarotonga, I imagine, from the moment he landed, and he stayed there for the rest of his life.
So what sort of place was Rarotonga back in those days?
I was very lucky that there were a lot of books that I could read, and also my grandfather had a lot of very good photos, or the family had very good photos, and also the museum in Wellington had very good photos. So I was able to really understand quite well what it would have been like. I describe Rarotonga as being in a great stagnant time warp, because for the first half of the 19th century, there was very little that we would think of in terms of modern things. There was a hotel where the Banana Court is, some administration buildings and packing sheds for fruit. The roads were described by Sir Tom Davis as coral with potholes. There was no electricity or motor vehicles. Horses still pulled ploughs and wagons, and there were no fridges, only ice boxes. Yes, there was a truck that took big blocks of ice around the island to keep things cool. And while visitors might have found this fascinating, for residents, it meant a very challenging life and a lot of hard work. And so when Boss arrived, our ships arrived to Rarotonga at Awatu, and they came through a hole in the reef and anchored, and then a small lighter boat took them from the ship over to the wharf.
So all a bit different from the San Francisco that Boss was heading for in the first place, then.
Totally different, yes. I love to imagine what it must have been like for him to arrive, from... I was just talking to my mum about it last night. New Zealand is a very... You could call it gloomy. When you arrive, it's more sort of dark ferns and black sand. But when you arrive to the Cook Islands, you arrive to beautiful turquoise lagoon and white sand. And I think, John, that captivated you as well, from what I hear.
Yeah, you're spot on with that one, yeah. You say you don't remember your grandfather directly, so why did you decide to delve into his history and write about him?
I felt quite a sense of responsibility. My mum is a real archivist, and both she and my dad were effectively only children. My dad did have a brother, but he died sadly quite young. So both my mum and my dad ended up with all their family papers and so on. And Dad had a very good collection of Cook Island books and very good letters from my grandfather and excellent photos. So I felt that before the family let those go, because we really do need to, work out where everything goes, that I needed to tell the story and to honour this man who had done such a huge job and made a huge contribution actually to our family's future.
He certainly sounds like quite a remarkable person. What did you learn about the man himself? What sort of person was he?
I think I get the feeling he was quite a stern man. It interests me that he's never smiling in the photos. I think he took life very seriously, but there's no doubt he was ambitious because he set out for San Francisco, so he's also adventurous. He wasn't prepared to just take life without seeing what he could make of it. When I look at all the things he achieved and was involved in during his life on Rarotonga, it's very impressive. But he was also a family man, and one of the hard things that came through all the information I had was how sad it was for him that he sort of, when you're young, you don't think about the consequences of your choices, and he made the choice to live on Rarotonga, and what that meant for him in terms of a family life was that he was on his own a lot of the time. So he ended up being an extremely good letter writer, which I've benefited from for this book. He wanted to learn to do things as well as he could. He experimented with growing different crops. He was fascinated with growing, actually. And he and another old chap of the time, some of the Cook Islanders will remember this name. His name was Johnny Webb. They started the first canned orange juice enterprise to try and solve the problem of the oranges not shipping terribly well.
I also got the impression from what you wrote that although you say he had to be sort of quite a tough man in that environment, he was also a very kind man.
I get that impression too. I've been lucky to speak to a couple of Cook Islanders that were around in his time, and I think he was a very good friend to people, and he was very generous, and he certainly, was very popular and loved in the community because of that kindness. Yes.
Now, Pacific commerce was a complex business in the early 20th century, so how did Boss go about learning to be an island trader?
Boss left school at the age of, we think about 14, with a proficiency certificate from Flag Swamp School in the South Island. So in those days, that was quite typical of the amount of education that children got. In fact, only half of the children ended up going to school. So what he learned is actually in what I call the University of Life. He learned what he had to learn. He learned about growing. I mean, what he would have experienced in cold South Otago in terms of, vegetable growing and so on would have been totally different from the growing that he was involved in the Pacific, which was the beautiful oranges and tomatoes and pawpaws and pineapples and so on, bananas. So he became a very good grower, and he must have taught himself that. He took on at the age of, he must have been 29, he bought a business with a huge loan. It was actually called a debenture in those days. So he was burdened with an enormous loan that he had to repay. So he had to learn about, paying back loans and making money and so on. And in order to be an island trader, he had to also understand shipping, because to be an island trader in those days, you had to be able to procure fruit, and a lot of that came from the outer islands, and sell that, and enable or help the local people to sell that, so that they then had some money to buy the goods that you had for sale in your store. So, yeah, he had to learn all those things as they cropped up.
What I didn't know until I read what you've written is that the CITC actually evolved from an earlier company. What can you tell me about those origins?
Yes. Well, that was something that wasn't known for a long time. And in fact, I remember my father being very excited. So the CITC had its centenary in 1991. That was the centenary of the setting up of the original CITC, which was called the South Pacific Trading Company, based in the Hervey Islands. I'm not sure if it's Hervey or Harvey, it's Hervey, which was the original name of the Cook Islands. But in 1990, so that's just a year before the centenary celebrations, a chap called George Paniani, who was an archivist on Rarotonga, was sorting through some old boxes of papers that he found, and found the original prospectus. The South Pacific Trading Company was really just an assembly of people and activities, and they formed some sort of a conglomerate. They had a place where they operated from, and what they were offering in the prospectus was a bunch of stuff, like there was a steam engine, there were some boilers, a coffee cleaning machine, and a schooner, the Jessie Nicholas. There was some cargo boats, horses, wagons. So it was a matter of a bunch of people getting together and trying to put together an enterprise that could attract some capital, because, in those days, basically everything was, and it's the same these days. There's never enough money to do the things that you think can be done.
So here we have a young man deciding to settle on Rarotonga, a young man who was essentially an accounts clerk with his sights set on a new life in America. So how did he end up taking over the Cook Islands Trading Company?
6 years after he landed on Rarotonga, the South Pacific Trading Company, which by then had been renamed the Cook Islands Trading Company, came on the market again, and he explored the opportunity of buying that with a couple of other people that he had met while he was on Rarotonga.
But he needed capital for that, I guess.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, he can't have had much money, but these people that he met did have money. Although they didn't actually want to live on Rarotonga, they had an interest in being involved in Rarotonga. One was a guy called Thomas Bunting of Bunting Brushes, and he was a very good business partner to Boss. And there was another chap who provided a very big debenture.
So you say a debenture, is that basically a sort of loan?
A debenture is like a private loan. I think it was really daunting, because what I worked out was that he paid $2 million for the business in today's money. And for a young man, who came from basically no money in the family, That would have been a huge amount of responsibility and risk to take on. And I think actually that it was a burden for him for all his life.
You refer in the book to, and I quote here, a fascinating array of characters at the turn of the 20th century who found their way to the South Seas in Boss's time. And among them, there are some iconic figures in Cook Islands history that pepper his story. Who are we talking about, and what part did they play in Boss's life?
I was very lucky that there were a few terrific characters who not only sailed the world until they found their paradise in the Cook Islands, but they wrote about it. They were people who they were attracted to this allure of the beautiful South Pacific. And of course, once they got there, they found that their dreams had come true, and they were beautiful tropical islands with beautiful, gentle people, and they just wanted to stay. And then they had to try and find a means of staying. Two of them were actually terrific writers, and what they wanted to do was live on a remote Pacific island, do a little bit of work as required in order that they could do their writing. And those two characters that I'm thinking of are Tom Neal, who wrote An Island to Oneself, that I'm sure many of people are aware of. And he worked for Boss part-time on one of the islands. And also Robert Frisby, who wrote the Book of Puka Puka. And he had marvellous descriptions of the boats arriving to the islands and the goods that were sold on the islands. Those guys and people like that, they just painted such a wonderful picture for me of what life was like in the islands at that time.
You talked about Tom Neal there. Tom, who was known, although he didn't like this title, he was known as the Hermit of Saguaro. And he lived alone on that island he lived alone on Saguaro for 16 years in total. But I believe he also actually worked for Boss. He ran one of the outstations, if I can call it that.
He did, and I'm trying to remember which island that was. There were branch stores on the bigger islands, for example, Aitutaki, Mangaia, Mauki, and Puka Puka, as I mentioned, where Robert Frisby was. I'm not absolutely sure, but I could find out from the Island to Oneself what island it was that Tom Neal was on.
I think I can help you there. I know Tom worked as a storekeeper on Attu and Puka Puka.
But he always wanted to go back to Suaro or Suvarov. It was just his dream to just get away and be on his own.
Today, CITC, as I said at the beginning, is the closest the Cook Islands gets to a department store with a whole host of modern goods on offer. But what would you find in the CITC of your grandfather's day?
That's very interesting. And once again, because of these excellent books, and also my mum, who lived there for a year in 1954, was able to tell me quite a lot about that. And also I spoke to this lovely woman who actually worked for Boss, Te Peru Witta was her name, and she told me that they stocked everything. She couldn't believe how wonderful the variety of things were. So I suppose from the point of view of a young girl, not knowing what life was like outside Rarotonga, it just seemed like a place full of treasures. Boss was very proud when he found the right goods for people. Lights, lamps, bicycles, masses of tinned food like bully beef and cabin bread. My mum reminded me that 4-poster beds with mosquito nets were literally lifesavers. And I did write in my book about when the guitar arrived, and that was just like transformational for the local people because they're very musical and love their dancing, and that became very popular. And Boss actually sponsored bicycle races around Rarotonga, when the bicycles became popular. And fabrics were huge. All the women made their own clothes. So fabrics and sewing machines, the old treadle sewing machines. Pariu was like a currency. For example, all the girls would get a length of pariu for Christmas from Boss. And the people, until jandals came, what we call jandals, you guys might call them thongs, came.
We call them flip-flops.
Flip-flops. Most people were just barefooted.
So it sounds like it really was a bit of a wonderland, this new CITC superstore.
Well, I'm sure Boss would have loved it to be a wonderland. And I have got photos of the inside of the store, and it does look like a wonderland, especially when it was decorated for Christmas, or, when the boat came in. It was a terribly exciting time because everyone wanted to know what had come in on the boat and, what new exciting things might have arrived in store.
Now, Boss's story isn't all about business, though. You tell a lovely story about a whirlwind romance in Boss's life.
Yes. So in 1919, Boss did get back on a steamer to go to San Francisco. He actually was going to buy a new boat for the business because the one that he had wasn't adequate for the job, and he went to San Francisco and purchased the Tagua, which was an incredibly important boat to him and his business. And on the steamer coming back from San Francisco, he met Irene Pearson, and she was a New Zealander whose family had just travelled across the United States. Her father was similar to Boss in that he also had been a trader. He'd been a trader in the South Island, and built up a very successful business. So he was able to take his family travelling through the United States. And Boss and Reen met on the steamer coming back from San Francisco, and it was obviously one of those whirlwind shipboard romances because by the time the boat arrived in Rarotonga, he had asked my grandmother if she would step off in Rarotonga and have a break there and see the place that he loved, to see whether she loved it too. And she did, and yes, they ended up getting married.
I have to say that the photograph, she looks like an incredibly beautiful woman.
She was beautiful, yes.
Following the Wall Street crash in 1929, it sounds like times became particularly tough for Boss. What do you know about those years?
This is really quite a theme through my book, is the incredible vagaries of trading life in the islands. I'm sure it's the same with all the Pacific Islands because they're very heavily impacted by anything that happens anywhere else in the world, and including, they also have tropical storms and so on. So by 1929, actually the years from 1916 to maybe late 20s were pretty good for Boss, and he was able to pay back a lot of the debt that he had. But in 1929, when the whole world went belly up, including CITC, his business partners basically walked away, and there were no boats coming to the islands. And it was actually only the plantations that provided a livelihood for Boss.
He got the plantations as part of the deal when he bought CITC, I believe.
Yes, he got some plantations. I think the understanding was that they were going to provide valuable copra, which they didn't because the copra price bottomed out. But he was able to use the plantations to establish obviously a reasonably good fruit growing business as well.
So that basically kept him afloat during some difficult times.
That was at times extremely helpful and at other times extremely unhelpful. See, the trouble with island trading was that it was so vulnerable to whether or not ships sailed, to take produce away from the Cook Islands, and often it would be weeks before boats arrived, and the crop, the fruit would have rotted or was no good anymore. And then, of course, it was terribly, terribly hard times for the people.
The stresses and strains eventually take a toll on Boss's health. In 1939, he decides to leave Rarotonga. You described that as a burnout, but what did it mean for CITC?
There was a huge hurricane in 1935 that destroyed all the crops. I mean, this is what I'm talking about, life in the islands. It was just so uncertain. There were so many ups and downs. But by 1939, when the war started, he was very depressed. Actually, he had taken himself to Sydney in 1938 to a sanatorium, a place of rest, basically. He just felt so unwell and he needed to get away. And what the valedictorian. They couldn't find anything particularly wrong, but they said he just needed to get away and have a break from his business. So he left the Cook Islands in 1939 because he basically couldn't run a business during the war. There were no boats, there was no business. He had a manager who just held the store. You know, there was obviously a small amount of stuff still to be managed there. And he went down to New Zealand. He leased out his schooner, the Tagaua, to the New Zealand government, and that was a great help for his business to survive. And he went down to New Zealand himself and got a job at a importing exporting company in Christchurch called A.M. Satterthwaite's. And for the first time, he and his family were all living together because his sons were educated in New Zealand, and so his wife had to spend a lot of time in New Zealand. She also had filariasis, I think it's called, which is like an allergy to mosquitoes, and so she couldn't actually be in the Cook Islands during the mosquito season.
All that said, he was eventually forced to return to Rarotonga after a spectacular fire in 1946 destroyed the main store. Boss must have been devastated to see his hard work go up in smoke. So what's the story there?
This is a part of the story I find very, very hard to understand. You know, for the first time, and he had been so unwell before he left for New Zealand. Boss had a very good job in New Zealand. His family was together. He had left the Cook Islands because he just found it so stressful. But in 1946, some young men broke out of the prison and burned down the CITC, the beautiful old CITC main store, which there's a picture in the book. It was a beautiful building. And Boss felt compelled to return because basically that was what he'd bought the business in 1916. So by 1946, that was 30 years of his life that he dedicated to that project. And I don't think he was able to just walk away and leave it. He had to go back and see what could be salvaged.
So how did he manage to get back on his feet?
Interestingly, I think for the first time in Boss's working life, the period after his return was when his hard work came to fruition. The New Zealand government, boat services improved. The New Zealand government suddenly decided that if the Cook Islands was going to ever be able to stand on its own feet, it had to provide better support to them. It provided more support, more money, it built some infrastructure, and things were actually very buoyant for the last period of Boss's life. I'm extremely pleased to see, because it meant that for the first time actually in his working life, apart from his time in Christchurch, I think he was actually able to feel like he was being successful and things were going well.
So we're talking now about sort of 1950s and 60s, which was a big time of change in the Cook Islands. It was moving towards self-government in 1965. Boss sadly died in 1958, and his son Neil took over the business. What were those years like for Boss and then subsequently Neil, and indeed for the CITC?
I've got a lot of letters between Neil and Boss from the 1950s period. So Dad was at the university in Auckland in the early 1950s, and Boss was very accepting of that. He wanted his son, obviously, to have an education, but by the mid-1950s, he's like, you need to get up here and you need to put some effort into this business that I'm building up for the family, you know, this sort of family thing. And he desperately wanted some help. He was not physically very well. And there's a huge amount of pressure at that time on Dad to try and come up and do what he could. But Dad at that stage he just, after he completed his degree, and it was a law degree, he was setting up his own law practice, and he had married my mum in 1953, and they had two children by the mid-1950s. So Dad was extremely torn, and Boss was getting quite I think the word is irascible and demanding, and he was just very anxious. He was anxious about his health, and he was anxious about what was going to happen to the business when he was no longer there, and he could not see that Dad was in a position to do that. So it was a cause of great sadness between them, and a big focus of the letters that I had.
It sounds then as though Neil stepped up to the mark and kept the business running.
So my grandfather died in 1958, and the business was really in a holding pattern for a few years. My dad's brother, Henley, was a decorated war pilot. He was a very, had been done some incredibly brave flying during the war, and he was living on Rarotonga, but he wasn't really interested in the business. He was more interested in the plantation, but he was able, with a very good manager of the time, a guy called Frank Bateson. Frank Bateson and Henley were able to tide the business over. But unfortunately, in 1961, Henley died and Frank Bateson left the island. So Dad actually had to run the business with the help of managers for a few years while he sort of, first of all, got his law practice established, and then had enough, partners and other people in the business so that he could make his way to spend more of his time on Rarotonga. And eventually in 1980, Mum and Dad moved up to Rarotonga and lived there for 20 years.
So here we are today, Adie, with CITC still the biggest store in the Cook Islands, albeit very different from when it began trading. But I was fascinated to learn that there is a direct link between where the main CITC store is located in Rarotonga today and those earliest days.
The original CITC of 1891 prospectus boasted the finest position on the island, on which is erected a new store for trading. And that is where the CITC still is today, the main store of the CITC. The store was remodeled by Neil first of all in the 1960s. That was the first time there was a remodeled store after the fire. And then it was remodeled again in the 1980s and in the 1990s, and the new owner who took over from Dad in 1998, Trevor Clark, has remodeled it further. So it's a beautiful looking store, but in exactly that same position, the finest position on the island.
When you visit Rarotonga and no doubt shop at CITC, do you feel a sense of history, a pride in what your grandfather founded?
I feel a great sense of connection because of the very happy family times we had there. I remember having marvellous times in the Cook and on Rarotonga, because it's a marvellous place, a wonderful place, and the Cook Islanders are very special people. And because I've written the story, I know the huge effort Boss made. And then Dad continued it after that. And yeah, I feel great pride in both of them for their vision and their hard work and what they achieved. Yeah, I am aware of that, and it's really wonderful to see.
Adie, the book's now in its final draft. What plans have you got for publishing it and sharing this remarkable story of Boss with a wider audience?
The book is being published privately for friends and family. It's been a big decision how many books to print. They've been designed beautifully. I've got wonderful photos. A friend of mine, a very clever guy called John Ringer, has put it together for me. And I've actually decided to only print 100 copies because they will be, 200 copies because they will be expensive. We're going to have a little launch in Auckland, and I am going to send a bunch of books up to the Cook Islands, up to friends up there, and also the library, so that there are copies available for people who want to view them. And I'm also exploring whether I might make an ebook available as well, if people are interested. Maybe, John, you can put some information up on your website and people can track me down if they really want a copy of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you thought of actually selling it in the CITC?
I did look at that, but as I say, the cost per copy is a bit high for it to be really, something that the business is able to sell in the store. Yes,
Are you pleased with the end result?
I'm extremely pleased. I'm absolutely delighted, and I'm so happy to have had a chance to tell the story because it's a great story. In fact, I've read it so many times now, and every time I read it, I still feel so emotional about it. It's like I feel a great sense of pride about, my grandfather, and I feel I know him better now, and I'm very, very proud of him and what he did, and my dad also.
In the conclusion to the book, Adie, you reflect on all the work you put in to tell your grandfather's story. I think it'd be fitting to end this chat by asking you to read that conclusion for us.
For me, writing the story has been an unexpected joy. I have developed an intense affection for Boss McKegg. What I didn't know until I began was that he was a lefty like me. And in September 1954, he called me Damaris in his letters to my mother, Diane. That is what my grandchildren now call me, so it's my name of 5 generations. I feel blessed and very proud that Boss McKegg, Cook Islands trader, was my grandfather.
Adie Swinburn, thank you so much for sharing that fascinating insight into an iconic figure in Cook Islands history. Thank
You're
you.
most welcome, John. Thank you for the opportunity.
And thank you for listening. Join me again soon for more insights into this Polynesian paradise in the South Pacific. I'm John Roberts, and this is CookieCast, the podcast all about the Cook Islands.